I want to raise a couple of issues with you, Chris. I mean, it is lovely to have some optimism. I'm feeling less pessimistic than I ever have in 25 years reporting on this stuff, largely because of the technological changes. But solar power at the moment is less than 1% of global total power.
Yes.
And we simply can't scale it up just quickly enough.
Well, the question I would ask you, Roger, is why can't we scale it up quickly enough? It's actually a relatively simple problem to solve. For the last 50 years, solar power has grown on average at 40% a year. And it's grown pretty reliably between 30 and 50% a year. That is to say, each year there was 25, 30, 40, 50% more solar PV installed than ever before. There is no constraint on the amount of solar that we can put in. It's now responsible, as Roger said, for less than 1% of world energy demand, although it might crash through 1% sometime next year. But if we continue on that 40% trajectory, by 2035, we'll cover the entire energy needs of the world from solar PV. And you're probably saying to yourself, things never work out like that. How can he be so insane as to think this could happen? But I want you to ask yourself, why not? If solar PV is the cheapest technology in the world, and a big contract, for example, was let to a large international corporation to build PV in India this week at a price of less than 7 cents, US dollar cents per kilowatt hour. That is cheaper than you can get electricity from coal or from gas in India. That's occurring around the world all the time, and all it requires is some more factories to put out solar panels. We're also seeing historically unprecedented rates of improvement in non-conventional solar panel technology. You think of solar panels, we all think of solar panels as big bits of silicon encased in glass. It ain't going to look like that in 10 years' time. It's going to be plastic adhered to the side of buildings. There'll be no environmental issues, nobody will be complaining about the fact that land has been taken over for this. Through things like that, we are going to be able to access energy at lower prices than we've ever been able to do so before. So I'm not an optimistic person by nature, but every time I look at the technology in this entire field, I say, my goodness, the progress is so fast that we could really envisage switching all new generation away from fossil fuels within a few years.
Because I am an optimist by nature, but when I hear your prognosis, I just sense rose-tinted spectacles. You're talking about electricity demand being met by solar. I think the International Energy Agency projects 50% solar by 2050. Then there's all of heating. Then there's all of heating for industry. Then there's all of transport.
Yes.
Need. I mean, this is massive, and we haven't even started to look at how to tackle those issues.
So, if I may use an example from the UK, I chaired a conference today on the creation of an energy-independent Cornwall. What can this county, which has very high energy prices, the greatest amount of fuel poverty in England, what can it do to make itself independent using only non-fossil fuel? And we looked in detail at how the energy demand of Cornwall is made up, how much of it's electricity, how much of it's oil for heating, how much of it's gas, how much it's cars. And we said how much of that could be switched to electricity. A very large amount of that can be switched to electricity, whether it's electric cars or whether it's electricity for heating through heat pumps. There are enormous problems in the transition of non-conventional electricity using out from fossil to PV. But there's absolutely no reason why the vast majority of energy uses cannot be moved to energy carriers that were created by the sun, whether it's electricity created by solar power, whether it's heat created by solar thermal panels on the roof, whether it's the next 2 generations on, and we're already seeing this being commercialized in the United States, if effectively artificial photosynthesis, photons of light hitting things in water, which then produces usually microbes, which then produces a byproduct, ethanol, which is effectively a substitute for petrol. There are no limits to how we can use the energy from the sun to generate reasonable living standards for everybody in the world. The sun is pouring, I'll just give you a sense of the scale. The world at the moment is using about 17 terawatts. Don't worry about what a terawatt is. That's how much the world is using today. The sun is giving us today 90,000 terawatts. Only a small fraction of that's converted into wind or anything like that. We are going to end up, as a world, using the power of the sun as the main way in which we generate the energy in the forms that we want. Now, Roger's quite rightly accused me of having rose-tinted spectacles. That, however, that statement that solar will become the dominant energy source of the world is a statement made by the CEO of Shell 4 weeks ago. He said it was the dominant energy backbone of the world will be solar photovoltaics. Not many people know. I don't know did you see that, Roger? I mean, it's a truly remarkable statement.
I reported it before then.
Yeah, but sorry. Okay. It was always one-upmanship.
He probably picked it up.
So it's not just the nutters like me who work on green energy who think that in the end everything's going to be solar. Even people whose livelihoods depend upon the maintenance of a fossil fuel economy know that it's just a question of time. Our task as a society is to make it happen fastest and with as least disruption as possible to the people who are least able to afford the transition.
Splendid, thank you, Chris. Now, I would like to take comments and questions from the audience. If I can start by asking those people who want to talk about adaptation, so at least get questions grouped together. I'm happy to have people speaking from their own experience or their own professional experience or asking questions along those lines. So can we take adaptation and resilience questions first? So start with the gentleman here who's in my eye line, and then there's a woman at the front and the man at the back. Let's take 3 questions and see how we go. Please do say who you are and where you're from.
I wanted to ask Roger Harriman and Chris Goodall about the solar power. Was that plant you visited in Morocco concentrated solar power,
yes,
or PVC cells?
Yes, concentrated solar, yes.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that's the future. But, of course, the problem with electricity, until someone invents a way of storing it in large quantities, is you have to use it as you generate it. And the problem is getting all that wonderful solar energy from the deserts of the world to where it's going to most needed. And I think the best way of doing that is through direct current cabling. But of course it's expensive, but it would then get into the European grid or the Asian grids. And you were congratulating the Germans, and a few years ago I took 2 of the leading German engineers in concentrated solar power, Gerhard Knies, and I've forgotten the other one's name. I took them to meet our energy minister, Frank Field, organized it. It was in the Brown government, and I'm afraid that you're both way ahead of our then minister. He just couldn't see how North African energy could get into the European grid and could solve. He seemed to think that electricity flowed like a stream, and that the southern European nations would get hold of it before we did. However, I'd just like you to comment on all those questions of how we can get this wonderful, huge amount of concentrated solar-powered energy into our homes.
Thank you. We'll come to that. So there's a woman here with hand up in this first row, second row, and then a man behind.
Hi. Basically, I was going to talk about...
Please say who you are, where you're from.
I'm Sophia. I'm a master's scholar at Forum for the Future. That's pretty much it. I was going to comment on the solar revolution as well. I find it really interesting, the approach that Chris had in terms of, like, obviously the technology is there. I'm completely behind that. I think the how isn't. I think it's quite clear that politics isn't helping in that regard, and also big business, it's too much in their vested interest to stay in fossil fuels. And you seem very dismissive of the effect that transition towns could have into entering like a low carbon economy, where actually I think they're the people who are adapting this the fastest and could make the biggest change. So I suppose my question is, like, how do we utilize that technology, and why isn't it communities? Because I think it is.
Okay, thank you. And there's a man behind somewhere. Okay.
Thank you. My name's Chris Bennett. I'm retired. I'm researching mainly on the failure of the political world to respond to the issue on the national levels. They're doing wonderfully at the UN level, but national politicians are not gripping the issues satisfactorily at all. But anyway, my question was on hydrogen, and I've heard no mention of the hydrogen economy. The wonderful Germans are doing a huge amount of work in this area. European Union is. It's a wonderful storage medium, and I would be interested to hear your opinions.
Okay, thank you. Chris, I guess all these are in some way aimed at you and to some extent to me. Francis, do you have expertise or thoughts in these areas?
I can say a few things.
Yeah, please do.
So, I think often when one talks about renewables and this future that Chris talks about, where you actually may have 100% renewables, it seems a long way off. It always seems a little bit like science fiction, and there's the 1% number that Roger mentioned. But I think there are also some hard facts. So at a global level, in 2014, half of capital investment in new power generation, so that's 50% of all the money invested in new power generation in the whole of the world last year, went on renewable technology. So the point is that we're already well underway with this huge transition that's happening, and that is only growing. So if it was 50% last year, it'll be 53% this year, and so on. So we're in the middle of a transition that we're only beginning to glimpse, but because these systems, energy systems, are so large, and because the overturning of them takes a generation, a nuclear power plant may have a life of 40 years, a coal-fired power station the same, that even though you have really accelerated uptake of these technologies, and this is globally, also in China, in India, in the United States, in the big economies of the world, in Germany, actually this is already in train, and there's a kind of inevitability about it now. The numbers don't lie. And I think The Economist was right a few months ago when it talked about really a new age in energy, that we've been very used to thinking about energy as a scarce commodity and something that is deeply political and very expensive and complicated. But actually, and The Economist argued that we are, with solar PV particularly, entering into quite a new kind of world of abundance in energy, and also, therefore, energy which is distributed in geopolitical terms in quite different ways, because actually the sun shines more brightly in the Sahara, and therefore we might want to have, particularly efficient collection of photons there, but actually it shines pretty well in the UK and Norway and Sweden as well, where we can capture it with these technologies. So I think this transition that we talk about is not something in the future, it's actually now. It'll take a long time to unfold just because of the hugeness of these systems and because their overturning takes a while. But, this is happening all around us now, and if we could only recognize it and be encouraged by that. Of course, when UK governments make mistakes with their policies, but I think these are blips, because actually this is a fundamental historical shift, a transition of the deepest kind that is now underway. It's unstoppable, actually. And, maybe Mr. Osborne is wrong now, but he'll have to get back on the train quite soon, and in any case, the rest of the world is passing us by.
Well, and anyway, he may introduce policies in the next fortnight which actually make us think, oh, well, he was right all along.
Yeah.
Or he may not. I hear a laugh. I'm sorry about that. What was I going to say? I was going to say, Chris.
We had three questions there. The first from the gentleman over there was on concentrating solar power predominantly from North Africa and southern Sahara Desert. This is a long-term plan that was established to put a lot of electricity generating capacity in the sunniest parts of some of the sunniest parts of the world, and then take that electricity through a new network of high voltage direct current lines across the Mediterranean to Italy, and then through Italy, through Germany, eventually reaching Northern Europe. Vastly expensive, and the scheme fell apart in the end because nobody really wanted to put that many billions into Libya at the time or other countries on the North African coast. There remains a plan, a very, very productive and effective and financially interesting plan to put a large concentrating solar power plant in Tunisia, which looked as though it was going to go ahead until the assassinations on the beach a few months ago. So very interesting technology, but it requires large-scale installations. And as I read it, could well be wrong about this, as I read it, the world is moving towards complete decentralization of energy supply, so that you'll get your electrons from the solar PV plant just down the road, or the wind turbine on the hill. That seems to me to be what's happening worldwide. It's happening particularly obviously in places like India without any significant grid infrastructure. So if you want people in those countries to get reliable electricity, and about 1.5 billion people don't have access to electricity at all, if you want to give that 1.5 billion electricity, you're going to do so probably in small-scale installations without any national grid to accompany it. And then Sophia down here was saying that she thought transition towns would be the right sort of institution, if I understood her correctly, to act as the vanguard, the people who are making this transition, to use that word again, happen. And I agree. The problem I face, and having done a lot of talks, as I say, in drafty church halls, is that yes, you can get 5% of the population interested in this, but in making them interested and getting them to support something like transition towns, in a sense, it could be argued, and I'm very waiting to be told I'm wrong, that you're just creating a separatist movement of extremists. And to be successful in getting the change to happen fast enough, you need to bring the whole society down there. And I'm sceptical about whether that, I'd love to be convinced, I'm sceptical about whether it can happen. You'll tell us I'm wrong. And then the third person, Chris, was asking about hydrogen. Now, hydrogen may well be a very effective storage mechanism for the PV that we can't use. We do what we used to do in the fifth form at school. I'm sorry, that shows how old I am. Year 11 in school, and we put 2 electrodes into water and we generate some hydrogen and some electricity and some oxygen off the 2 different electrodes. That gives you hydrogen. Hydrogen is a reasonably good energy carrier, but not that great. The problem is it's extremely expensive to store, and it doesn't really solve our problem. I think, and my book coming out from Profile Books in May of next year will tell you more about this, that actually what we will end up doing is taking that hydrogen, which we create from surplus electricity through electrolysis, and turning it into methane. A very simple chemical process to do. That methane is effectively the same as the natural gas in our gas mains, and that means that we've got a storage infrastructure, a cheap storage infrastructure already there. And that, I think, is one of the most interesting technologies in the world, called power to gas. Germany and Denmark, dinner parties, they talk a little else. Here, I've never heard it mentioned. But if you want another example of Germans changing the world, look on the internet for a company called Electrochaea and say, if this works, it changes everything. We've got rid of our storage problem.
Thank you, lucky Germans.
May I come in?
Can I just hold on for a second? We'll come back to transition towns in a minute. I just wanted to tell the audience a story that I heard, well, a sort of story that I heard from Lord Brown, the former head of BP, on hydrogen. I was sitting next to him at dinner, and we'd had quite a few glasses of wine. And this was fairly recently after George Bush Jr. had talked about his great hydrogen highway that he was going to set up in the States. So I waited until we were just finishing the dessert and getting ready for the cheese. And I said to Lord Brown, you know, this hydrogen highway, it looks to me like an attempt by the incumbents in the petrol and oil industry to just continue using their infrastructure. I think there's probably nothing in it. He said, yeah, absolutely right. And I thought, crikey, now where do I go with this? Because I hadn't recorded it or anything, and it was an informal dinner. And I said, would you say that into my tape recorder? He said, could you pass the port? That, I think, is probably where we are with hydrogen. There are big problems with storage. Let me answer quickly, or comment quickly on the transport of electricity. Morocco already has a cable from Morocco to Europe. At the moment, Morocco is importing 93% of its energy. It intends, with a massive program of solar thermal, solar PV, wind, and also hydropower, to be reversing that flow and exporting clean energy to the Europe, southern Europe. So, you know, there is hope for that sort of thing. Let me get back to transition towns. Are the transitioners the people to carry the flag?
I think what I'd say is when transition towns started, I do recognise what you're saying there. So there was certainly a phenomenon where the people who got involved first were environmental activists, people who were ready for this, were already understood the problem and just wanted to get together and do something. The thing that excites me about what's happening now within the transition movement and beyond it, because it isn't just in communities labelled transition towns, is this power to engage a wider community and imaginative ways that happens. And just as an example, if you look at something like Brixton Energy, the community energy project there, where people living in council estates are buying into a community-owned energy company that's putting PV on the roofs of those council estates, and people who certainly weren't involved in phase 1, but you know they're now on to just planning for phase 4 of that project. The sorts of people who are involved, who are feeling, you know, looking for financial benefits, but are starting to get interested in where's our energy coming from and why does that matter. And I just want to say one other thing, and because I share the excitement that there is in this room about solar energy, and particularly about the sort of distributed nature of it and what that does in terms of power. But I just want to say that I'm nervous when I hear stories that can be interpreted as so we can just carry on with sort of patterns of consumption and patterns of living that are not sustainable, that are not taking account of the sort of wider impacts that we have on the planet. And the danger is that those stories can be really interpreted as that, as so this is just an excuse for business as usual. And I think we really need to be questioning, you know, all the resources we're using, you know, all the ways that we're living, and thinking about actually how do we make this something that's genuinely sustainable. And that's more than just a source of energy.
May I come? May I just... briefly comment back. I mean, it would be great. I'm just slightly skeptical whether that's happening or not. The one thing we're not short of is energy. We're going to have a lot of it. It's going to be cheap. It's going to be easily available. And as it turns out, most Western economies are seeing really quite fast declines in the amount of energy they're using. It fell by something like 6%, total energy requirements in the UK last year, and that's a consistent pattern. So we're now something like 30% below the levels of 1970 in total energy use, even though the population is much larger and we're much richer. So I worry about movements like the transition town saying we've got to change things because otherwise we're doomed. actually we're going on the right direction in terms of energy use. We're decarbonising too slowly, but we're decarbonising, and we're using much less of it. Clearly, as a planet, we can't continue using other resources like soil as profitably as we've been doing. But the one thing we're never going to be short of, if technology continues to improve at the rates improving, is what the photons coming to us from the sun. So I say it's water, it's soil, it's gross environmental pollution we're worried about. Actually, we shouldn't be worried about trying to constrain energy use.
But if you take the broader transition type point, energy consumption has indeed decreased thanks to massive increases in efficiency in fridges and freezers and all our appliances. But we've eaten away a lot of that improvement with our smartphones, our tablets, our laptops, our desktops, and we've almost created as much energy as we saved through all those official rules that were put onto energy appliances. So,
do you know how much this uses a year?
I have absolutely no idea, but I got that comment that I just made from somebody who's very knowledgeable about these things. So I'm taking it as read.
It might be 2% of your total electricity.
Yeah, but then you've got your
right.
iPad, and you've got your laptop, and you've got your desktop. And when you have them all on together, and your TiVo
and you've got the
box
servers,
and
you've
your
got
server.
servers.
When you add all those
Roger,
together,
your electricity use has gone down in
it
the
has.
last 10 years.
It has.
Right?
I'm not saying that it hasn't. I'm just saying that the improvements have been not negated, but they've been eaten away by the extra stuff that we're consuming through all the gadgets we have.
Well, I had a conversation with people at Apple. This isn't an Apple phone, by the way, but I'll just hold it up. And something like 3/4 of the resource use, the energy use that goes in to make something like this, or in its use phase, as they call it, occurs during the manufacture. Only a quarter of the use of a typical Apple computer or Apple phone occurs as the result of energy use actually in its.
But that would be an argument to buy less kit.
That's an argument to buy less kit, not to stop people having access to things like smartphones and tablets.
Okay, let me take some more questions. There's a woman here with a hand up, and a man there at the back, and a woman here in the front row.
Hi, my name's Polly Gould, and I'm finishing a PhD at the Bartlett School of Architecture. I noticed, Chris Goodall, that you said second on your list was meat. We've been speaking a lot about energy in terms of, a sustainable world, but I just think it's important to, if we think about meat as an example, it brings us back to consumption, individual choices, perhaps a kind of community responses to decisions that we make about what we spend money on and how we consume. So I wonder whether it might be useful to think of other examples rather than energy.
Okay, thank you. Now, who did I say next? Somebody at the back there. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Jim. I work for the House of Commons. You were talking just now about the energy that all these devices we have use. It's not only the energy they use, it's also the materials that go into them. I used to work in the mobile phone industry, so that they use a lot of rare minerals that are now running out from terrestrial sources, and we're going to have to start digging up the bottoms of the oceans, which would mean destroying animal communities before we've even discovered what they are. That was just an aside. My real question is about the Paris talks. They're quite well timed, coming at the end of what's expected to be the warmest year on record, and also.
I'm ever so sorry. We're all struggling to hear. What?
Paris talks, COP.
The Paris
Paris.
talks.
I'm so sorry. Yeah. No, we were hearing it as power something or other, but we're now getting
the Paris talks.
Yeah.
Sorry. They're coming at the end of what's expected to be the warmest year on record and one of the strongest El Ninos on record. And that there's been a lot of build-up in the media towards the Paris talks, as there was before Copenhagen 6 years ago. We know what happened then. or didn't happen, will Paris be any different?
Okay, thank you. And then there was somebody down here in the front. Yeah, just so the second row here.
I just would like to ask this optimism on solar, because I come from Finland, and in Russia we have solar panels under 3 feet of snow. So how do you solve it? Because in the winter the demand is the biggest, and I see the wind is the only one that I can see in a subarctic and Arctic region, and we have 173 million people living in Russia, and you need to heat the house and keep the systems running. That's one of the questions, that how do you solve this one? Because you never mentioned about wind power. Second question is this thing that we have Arctic warming, and the soils are decomposing and releasing carbon into atmosphere. So are we ready for this impact, for the biological input of the carbon from the methane, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide from melting permafrost? That is my question. Are we ready for this issue? How much carbon is coming from the ground? Because the ground is decomposing. The permafrost is decomposing.
Okay, thank you very much. Very, very good point. And let's start. I mean, I think that the truth is that none of our panels probably, unless France is qualified scientifically to make an assessment of methane. I mean, the IPCC didn't make any assessment of high impact, low frequency or low probability effects of climate change. Do you have a thought on that?
Well, it's one of these potential non-linearities. It's like the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which could have really, over the longer term, very dramatic effects on rates of sea level rise. And certainly the possible melting of the permafrost, and as you say, the release of carbon from that, the degradation of the organic matter contained there, will be, and there are models that predict that this might happen, and the scale of it, a really major accelerator actually of climate change in the future. It's one of these large unknowns which people are not quite able yet to predict, but certainly there are models that suggest that this could be a really major effect, this century or early next century. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, would you like to take on the meat question? Are your guns turned on meat? No, Sarah.
Okay. I'm happy to talk.
The meat question. It's actually something that's been debated around the transition movement. We try not to. So
are you a vegetarian?
I'm not personally, but my diet.
Should you be?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm gradually eating less and less meat. And I think it's my involvement in transition that has really made me question my diet. And that, I think, again, I mean, it's about the sort of the slow impact of actually working with people, looking with people at these issues, and then starting to go out from whatever brings you into the discussion, to start to look more widely at what's the impact of everything I consume and everything I do. So I've stopped flying, for example, and that was a real loss for me in terms of my connections to family, etc. And it's felt actually an easier thing to do now that I've got involved in transition because of that connection and support that I have from other people. And I think probably the next step is that I ought to be stopping eating meat.
You could go away from factory farming and have squirrel shooting parties. That would be sort of community-minded, wouldn't it? Anyway, Chris, a final thought on Paris. Chris, we have to close in a moment, so make it fairly brief.
My view, I'm afraid, is that international conferences of this type, are very unlikely to systematically change the course of emissions growth across the world. What we need is technology to help us. I'm afraid politics is not working in our favour at the moment.
I'm going to end on an up note, because that's such a dreary note. I've been following these climate talks for many, many years, far too many, and far too much tortuous midnight oil being burned, I have to say I think things are looking much more positive than they ever have before. More than 150 countries submitting detailed plans. I don't think that would have happened without the UN process. It's a question, of course, whether they fulfill their detailed plans, or whether if the governments change in those countries, whether they just say, actually, no, we don't want to keep these subsidies on solar or what have you. So that's a different matter. But the point is they are focused towards a joint goal. The Chinese and the Americans are walking hand in hand in the way they were never before, cooperating on energy policy and energy technology. You see other countries like India being drawn into the conversation about solar, partly because of money, of course, but also partly because of the great decarbonisation drive. So I think to say they will be a failure would be wrong. I think they've been a success in some terms before they've even started.
Yes, perhaps that's been far too...
to send people off jolly, you don't to send them off despairing. They can't eat meat, they have to eat squirrels, they can't fly. And then Paris is going to be in tears.
The countries in the world have shifted dramatically since Copenhagen. United States, China and India. So there is now a consensus amongst the countries that matter that something must be done. And absolutely, that probably wouldn't have occurred without the UNFCCC process.
Okay.
However, I don't think that the conference...
Okay, you didn't hear the however, so that's great. Let us thank our panel, ladies and gentlemen.